Grandma Vivian, why can't you just buy me a PlayStation? Tommy's grandma bought him one for his birthday. My 7-year-old grandson Oliver whispered during dinner, his innocent question cutting through the artificial cheerfulness that had been suffocating our family gathering. What happened next exposed a web of greed and manipulation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own daughter and son-in-law. They had no idea that their poor old mother secretly owned enough Sony shares to buy every PlayStation in the state. And what I did with that knowledge would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question hung in the air like smoke from a doused candle, and I watched my daughter Jessica's face transform from forced pleasantry to something darker, more calculating. She reached across the table with practiced concern, patting Oliver's small hand with the kind of gentle firmness that made my stomach clench. "Sweetie, you know Grandma Vivian is on a fixed income now. She has to be very careful with her money." Jessica's voice carried that particular tone reserved for explaining adult disappointments to children, but her eyes met mine with an expression I'd been seeing more frequently over the past year. Pity mixed with something else, something that made me feel like a burden rather than the one who had raised her. Marcus, my son-in-law, nodded sagely from his position at the head of my own dining room table, cutting into the roast I'd spent 3 hours preparing. "That's right, buddy. Grandma has to save every penny for important things like medicine and doctor visits. Maybe Santa will bring you something nice this year instead." I set down my fork carefully, watching this performance play out in my own home. Fixed income, the phrase they'd been using for months now, ever since I'd made the mistake of mentioning that I was being more mindful about expenses. What they didn't know was that my mindfulness had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with watching their behavior change whenever money became part of the conversation. "I understand, Mommy," Oliver replied, his disappointment genuine and heartbreaking. At 7, he couldn't grasp the complexities of adult finances, couldn't understand why his grandmother, who lived in a beautiful 3-bedroom house in Maple Grove's most desirable neighborhood, apparently couldn't afford a $300 gaming console for the grandson she adored. The truth was far more complicated. Hidden in my home office, behind a modest wooden desk that had belonged to my late husband Robert, sat portfolio statements that would have made Jessica and Marcus's eyes widen in disbelief. 23 years of careful investing, guided first by Robert's cautious wisdom and later by my own surprisingly sharp instincts for technology stocks, had created a nest egg that most people could only dream about. Sony Corporation shares represented just one small piece of a diversified portfolio worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But I'd learned to keep that information private after Robert's death 3 years ago, when Jessica had begun making comments about the burden of maintaining such a large house, the dangers of elderly people living alone, and the wisdom of simplifying one's financial obligations. Her suggestions had been gentle at first, wrapped in genuine seeming concern for my well-being, but I noticed how her attention sharpened whenever the conversation turned to practical matters like property taxes or investment management. "You know, Mom," Jessica continued, as if Oliver's request had triggered a thought she'd been saving for the right moment, "Marcus and I have been talking about your situation here. This house is getting to be a lot for you to handle." I looked around the dining room that Robert and I had chosen together, at the built-in china cabinet displaying dishes we'd collected during 35 years of marriage, at the bay window overlooking the garden where I still spent my mornings tending to roses that bloomed more beautifully each year. Situation, as if living independently in the home I'd shared with my husband was some kind of problem to be solved, rather than a choice to be respected. "I manage just fine, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Mrs. Patterson next door says I keep the nicest yard on the block." Marcus leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd found his opening. That's exactly what we're worried about, Vivian. All that yard work, the maintenance, the stairs to the second floor. What happens if you fall? What if something goes wrong and nobody's around to help? Oliver had returned his attention to pushing peas around his plate, but I could see him listening to this adult conversation with the intense focus children bring to discussions they sense are important but don't fully understand. This wasn't the first time Jessica and Marcus had raised these concerns in front of him, and I wondered what messages he was absorbing about aging, independence, and family responsibility. "I have my cell phone with me at all times," I said, "and Dr. Morrison says I'm in excellent health for someone my age. My balance is perfect, my reflexes are sharp, and I passed my driving test with flying colors last month." Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course you did, Mom. You're amazing for 72. But we worry about the financial stress. Property taxes, utilities, upkeep costs, groceries, medical expenses. It all adds up, especially on a fixed income." There was that phrase again, fixed income. They'd been using it like a mantra, as if repetition could make their assumptions about my financial situation become reality. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were discussing my supposed poverty while sitting at a dining table that had cost more than Marcus earned in a month at his insurance office job. "I'm comfortable," I said, which was probably the understatement of the century. My monthly dividend payments from various stock holdings exceeded what many families lived on annually. But Jessica and Marcus had constructed a narrative about their struggling elderly mother that seemed to comfort them in some way. "But comfortable and secure are two different things," Marcus pressed on, warming to his theme. "What we're thinking is a nice assisted living community, somewhere with activities, medical staff on site, no maintenance responsibilities. You could make friends your own age, join clubs, take classes." I studied his earnest expression, noting how he'd seamlessly transitioned from concern about my physical safety to enthusiasm about social opportunities. The sales pitch was smooth, practiced, as if he'd rehearsed these points, which I was beginning to suspect he probably had. "Some of those places are really beautiful now," Jessica added, her voice taking on the bright, encouraging tone she used when trying to convince Oliver to try new foods. "They have libraries and fitness centers and scheduled transportation to shopping centers. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Oliver looked up from his plate, confusion clear in his young face. "Are you moving away, Grandma Vivian? Who would take care of your garden?" The question hit me with unexpected force. Who would take care of my garden? Who would continue the careful cultivation of roses that Robert and I had started together? The careful selection and placement of perennials that had taken years to establish? Who would maintain the small memorial corner where I'd planted forget-me-nots in Robert's memory? "Nobody's moving anywhere, sweetheart," though I caught the quick glance between Jessica and Marcus that suggested they had different ideas about my future living arrangements. After dinner, while I was loading the dishwasher, I overheard Jessica and Marcus talking in low voices in my living room. Their conversation drifted through the kitchen doorway, and I found myself moving more quietly, listening with the sharp attention that 3 years of widowhood had taught me to apply to situations that felt significant. "She's being stubborn about this," Jessica was saying. "The longer she waits, the fewer options she'll have. The good places have waiting lists." "Maybe we need to approach it differently," Marcus replied. "Focus more on the financial benefits. If she sold this house, the proceeds could fund years of care in a quality facility. Plus, she wouldn't have the stress of managing investments and bills." Managing investments. The phrase made me pause in my dish loading. They assumed I was stressed by financial management, when in reality, I found it one of the most engaging aspects of my retirement. Following market trends, researching companies, analyzing quarterly reports had become a fascinating hobby that kept my mind sharp and my portfolio growing. What they didn't know was that my mindfulness had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with watching their behavior change whenever money became part of the conversation. "I understand, Mommy," Oliver replied, his disappointment genuine and heartbreaking. At 7, he couldn't grasp the complexities of adult finances, couldn't understand why his grandmother, who lived in a beautiful 3-bedroom house in Maple Grove's most desirable neighborhood, apparently couldn't afford a $300 gaming console for the grandson she adored. The truth was far more complicated. Hidden in my home office, behind a modest wooden desk that had belonged to my late husband Robert, sat portfolio statements that would have made Jessica and Marcus's eyes widen in disbelief. 23 years of careful investing, guided first by Robert's cautious wisdom and later by my own surprisingly sharp instincts for technology stocks, had created a nest egg that most people could only dream about. Sony Corporation shares represented just one small piece of a diversified portfolio worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But I'd learned to keep that information private after Robert's death 3 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They were pleased that Oliver had been disappointed because it served their narrative about my financial struggles. The realization sent a cold wave of understanding through me. This wasn't just about their concern for my welfare. This was about something else entirely. "I think we should bring up the maintenance issues next time," Jessica suggested. "The roof, the furnace, the driveway, all those big expenses that could come up." "Good idea. And maybe we should research some specific facilities, get brochures and pricing information, make it easier for her to see the advantages." I finished loading the dishwasher in silence, processing what I'd overheard. They were strategizing about my future with the methodical approach of people planning a campaign. Not discussing possibilities or exploring options, but developing tactics to convince me to make the decision they'd already determined was best. When they returned to the kitchen to say goodbye, their expressions were bright with the artificial cheer that had become so familiar over the past year. "Thanks for dinner, Mon," Jessica said, kissing my cheek. "It was delicious as always." "We should do this more often," Marcus added. Though we'd been having these monthly dinners for over a year, and the frequency had been Jessica's idea, not mine. "I'd like that," I replied, meaning it despite the undercurrent of manipulation I'd detected. Whatever their motivations, I cherished every opportunity to spend time with Oliver, to watch him grow and learn and discover the world. Oliver hugged me with the wholehearted enthusiasm that only children possess. "I love you, Grandma Vivian. Maybe I can help you in your garden next weekend." "I'd love that, sweetheart. We can plant some new bulbs for spring." After they left, I stood in my living room, looking around at the space that Jessica and Marcus viewed as too much house for one elderly woman. The built-in bookshelves filled with volumes Robert and I had collected together, the fireplace where we'd spent countless winter evenings, the comfortable furniture arranged for both solitude and entertaining. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of 35 years of marriage, the place where Jessica had grown up, the home where Oliver would hopefully create his own memories with his grandmother. But it was also, I was beginning to understand, an asset that other people had plans for. I walked to my home office, a small room that had once been Robert's study. His massive oak desk still dominated the space, though I'd replaced his engineering textbooks with my own collection of investment guides and market analysis reports. The computer was new, a sleek laptop that gave me access to real-time stock information and online trading platforms that would have seemed like science fiction when Robert and I were first married. Opening the desk drawer, I pulled out a folder containing my most recent portfolio summary. The numbers still surprised me sometimes, even after 3 years of watching them grow. Robert had been a conservative investor, preferring bonds and blue-chip stocks that paid steady dividends. After his death, I'd maintained his core holdings but gradually began exploring technology companies that seemed poised for growth. Sony Corporation had been one of my first major purchases after Robert's death. The company's diversification beyond electronics into entertainment, gaming, and financial services had impressed me, and their PlayStation division was generating substantial revenue from a growing gaming market. I'd purchased my first block of shares at $68. Today, they were trading at over $90, and I'd continued adding to my position whenever the price dipped. My Sony holdings alone were worth more than most people's annual salaries, and they represented less than 8% of my total portfolio. The irony of tonight's dinner conversation wasn't lost on me. Oliver had asked why I couldn't buy him a PlayStation, unaware that his grandmother owned enough Sony shares to buy every PlayStation in 3 states. But the deeper irony was darker. Jessica and Marcus were maneuvering to convince me that I couldn't afford to live independently, while I was quietly accumulating wealth at a rate that would have shocked them. They saw an elderly woman struggling on a fixed income. In reality, I was a savvy investor whose net worth had grown by more than 30% since Robert's death. The question that kept me awake that night was whether their concern was genuine but misguided, or whether something else was motivating their push for me to sell my house and move into managed care. The conversation I'd heard over suggested a level of planning and coordination that went beyond casual worry about my well-being. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the pattern of their visits and conversations. Jessica called every few days, always asking about my health, my energy levels, any difficulties I might be experiencing with house maintenance or daily activities. The questions felt casual, conversational, but I started noticing how often they focused on challenges rather than successes. When I mentioned that I'd spent a lovely afternoon reorganizing my closets, Jessica responded with concern about the physical demands of such tasks. When I told her about a new restaurant I'd discovered downtown, she worried about me driving in unfamiliar areas. When I described my latest gardening project, she expressed anxiety about me spending too much time in the sun. Every positive experience was reframed as a potential danger. Every sign of vitality became evidence of risky behavior for someone my age. I began to understand that I was being conditioned to see myself as frail and vulnerable, regardless of how capable and energetic I actually felt. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the PlayStation dinner. Margaret Chen had been managing my investments since Robert's death, and our quarterly meetings had become a highlight of my calendar. She was brilliant, direct, and respectful of my opinions about market trends and investment strategies. "Vivian, I have to tell you, your instincts about technology stocks have been remarkable," Margaret said, reviewing my latest portfolio performance. "The Sony position has been particularly strong. Have you considered increasing your allocation?" "I've been thinking about it," I replied. "Their gaming division continues to exceed projections, and I think the entertainment sector has more room for growth." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Your total return this quarter was exceptional. You're outperforming most professional managers I know." We discussed rebalancing strategies and potential new investments for about an hour. As our meeting concluded, Margaret hesitated at the door of her office. "Vivian, can I ask you something personal? Have you discussed your investment success with your family?" The question surprised me. "Not in detail. Why do you ask?" "I had an unusual phone call last week, someone claiming to be your daughter, asking about your account status and expressing concern about your ability to manage complex investments." The words hit me like ice water. "Jessica called you?" "She identified herself as your daughter and said the family was worried about you making investment decisions without proper oversight. She asked about setting up some kind of collaborative management structure." I sat back down heavily. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing, of course. I reminded her that I can only discuss account details with you, and I suggested she encourage you to add her as a contact if that's what you wanted." Margaret's expression was concerned. "But Vivian, the questions she asked were quite specific. She seemed to have some knowledge of your holdings." "What kind of questions?" She asked about the total value of your accounts, whether you'd been making any large withdrawals, and if there were any signs of confusion or poor judgment in your recent decisions. The room felt suddenly smaller. Signs of confusion. Jessica had been gathering intelligence about my mental state and financial management, building a case for why I might need outside oversight of my investments. "There's something else," Margaret continued. She mentioned that the family was concerned about the volatility of some of your holdings, particularly the technology stocks. She suggested that someone my age should be in more conservative investments. Someone my age, as if turning 72 automatically made me incapable of understanding market dynamics or making sound investment decisions. The irony was bitter, considering that my technology investments had consistently outperformed the conservative portfolio Robert had maintained for decades. Driving home from Margaret's office, I felt the weight of revelation settling over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about Jessica and Marcus being concerned about my living situation. They were actively investigating my financial status and building a case for intervention in my investment management. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with disturbing clarity. The repeated mentions of my supposed fixed income, the emphasis on maintenance costs and medical expenses, the suggested assisted living facilities that would eliminate my need to manage investments. They were constructing a narrative about an elderly woman whose judgment was declining and whose finances needed professional oversight. But whose oversight? And what would happen to my carefully built portfolio if they convinced someone I was no longer competent to manage my own investments? That evening, I called my attorney, David Richardson, whom Robert and I had worked with for over 20 years on estate planning and property matters. David had helped me navigate the legal complexities after Robert's death, and I trusted his judgment completely. "David, I need to ask you about something confidential. If someone wanted to take control of another person's financial decisions, what would that process look like?" There was a pause before he responded. "Are you concerned about someone trying to obtain guardianship or power of attorney over you?" "I'm not sure. Maybe." "Well, if someone believed you were no longer capable of making sound financial decisions, they could petition the court for guardianship. They'd need to provide evidence of incapacity, usually medical evaluations and documentation of poor judgment or confusion." "What kind of evidence would they need?" "Medical testimony, examples of financial mismanagement, testimony from family members about behavioral changes or confusion. The court would also likely order an independent evaluation." I thought about Jessica's phone call to Margaret, her questions about confusion and poor judgment, her concerns about my technology investments. And if they were successful? A guardian would have legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. They could restructure investments, sell property, move funds into what they considered more appropriate vehicles. Even if the person being evaluated disagreed with those decisions? Once guardianship is established, the ward's preferences become secondary to the guardian's judgment about what's in their best interest. The conversation left me feeling vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Jessica and Marcus weren't just encouraging me to move into assisted living for my own good. They were potentially building a legal case to take control of my financial decisions, decisions that had proven remarkably successful over the past 3 years. But why? What did they hope to gain from controlling my investments? The answer came to me 2 days later, when Oliver made an innocuous comment that illuminated everything. "Mommy says when people get really old, their kids have to help them make smart choices about money," he said, while we were planting tulip bulbs in my garden. "She says sometimes grandparents need help so they don't lose all their money." I paused in my digging, processing the implications of this casual 7-year-old observation. Did Mommy say anything else about grandparents and money? She said some old people buy silly things they don't need, and their families have to help them be more careful. Oliver placed another bulb in the hole I'd prepared, his small hands gentle with the tender shoots. But you're not silly, Grandma Vivian. You're the smartest person I know. Out of the mouths of babes. Jessica had been preparing Oliver for the idea that his grandmother might need family intervention in financial matters, planting seeds that would make him accepting of whatever changes might come. But Oliver's innocent trust gave me something more valuable than validation. It gave me motivation. That night, I spread my investment statements across Robert's old desk and began calculating exactly what my financial independence meant. The numbers were staggering even to me. Conservative estimates suggested that my net worth had grown to over $4 million, with monthly dividend and interest income that exceeded most people's salaries. I wasn't a struggling elderly woman living on Social Security and a modest pension. I was a successful investor whose wealth could provide security for multiple generations of my family, if managed properly. The Sony shares that could have bought Oliver a dozen PlayStations were just the tip of an iceberg that Jessica and Marcus couldn't even imagine. But they were planning to take control of that iceberg by convincing a court that I was too confused and frail to manage it myself. The realization sparked something in me that had been dormant since Robert's death. The sharp, competitive instincts that had helped us build a successful life together. The strategic thinking that had guided my investment decisions. The protective fury of a grandmother who would not let anyone threaten her family's future. If Jessica and Marcus wanted to play games with my money and my autonomy, they were about to discover that this particular grandmother was far from the helpless victim they imagined. But first, I needed to understand exactly what they were planning and how far they were willing to go to it. And I had a feeling that Oliver, in his innocent honesty, might be the key to uncovering the truth. The morning after my conversation with David Richardson, I woke with the clarity that only comes from having a specific mission. If Jessica and Marcus were building a case against my competency, I needed to understand their strategy completely before I could counter it effectively. Years of successful investing had taught me that information was the most valuable currency in any conflict, and I was about to become very wealthy in that particular commodity. My first stop was the Riverside Medical Center, where Dr. Morrison had been my primary physician for over a decade. If someone was going to question my mental competency, they would need medical evidence, and I wanted to understand what that evidence might look like. Dr. Morrison, I'd like to request a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, I told his receptionist when I called for an appointment. Is there a particular concern, Mrs. Blackwood? She asked, using the gentle tone reserved for elderly patients who might be experiencing confusion. I want a baseline assessment of my mental acuity for my own records, complete neurological workup, memory testing, everything. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, but Dr. Morrison called me personally that afternoon. Vivian, Sarah mentioned you're requesting cognitive testing. Is there something specific that's worrying you? I want documentation of my current mental state while I'm clearly functioning at full capacity, I replied. Call it insurance against future questions. There was a pause. Has someone raised concerns about your cognitive function? Not directly, but I have reason to believe they might in the future. I see. His voice carried the weight of experience with family dynamics around aging. Well, I can certainly arrange comprehensive testing. But Vivian, based on our interactions over the years, I would be very surprised if there were any issues with your cognitive function. That's exactly what I want documented. My next call was to Margaret Chen. Margaret, I need you to prepare a detailed report on my investment performance over the past 3 years. Include comparisons to market benchmarks, documentation of my decision-making process for major trades, and your professional assessment of my judgment. Vivian, is this related to the call from your daughter? It's related to protecting my right to manage my own finances. Margaret's voice sharpened with understanding. I'll have that ready for you by Friday. And Vivian, I want you to know that in my professional opinion, you've demonstrated exceptional investment acumen. Your technology sector picks have been particularly prescient. Include that assessment in your report. My third call was the most difficult. I dialed Jessica's number, knowing that what I was about to do would require every ounce of acting ability I possessed. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" Jessica's voice carried its familiar note of concern. "Actually, sweetheart, I'm struggling a bit," I said, allowing my voice to waver slightly. I've been having trouble keeping track of things lately. The change in Jessica's tone was immediate and unmistakable. Sharp attention replaced casual concern. "What kind of trouble, Mom?" "Oh, little things. I couldn't remember if I'd paid the electric bill last week, and yesterday I found myself standing in the grocery store completely blanking on what I'd come to buy. That sounds frustrating. Have you mentioned this to Dr. Morrison?" "Oh, little things. I couldn't remember if I'd paid the electric bill last week, and yesterday I found myself standing in the grocery store completely blanking on what I'd come to buy. That sounds frustrating. Have you mentioned this to Dr. Morrison?" "I have an appointment with him next week, but honestly, Jessica, I'm starting to worry about managing everything here. The investments, the bills, the house maintenance, it's all becoming so overwhelming." I could practically hear her mind racing through the implications. "Mom, you know Marcus and I are always here to help. Maybe it would be easier if we could take some of that burden off your shoulders." "How would that work?" "Well, we could help you organize your finances, maybe set up automatic bill paying, look into some investment management services, take the stress out of those daily decisions." Investment management services. The phrase confirmed my suspicions about their ultimate goal. That might be helpful. I just feel so confused about everything financial lately. "Don't worry about anything, Mom. We'll figure this out together. Maybe I should come over this weekend and we can look at your paperwork together. Would you? That would be such a relief." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, processing what I'd just heard. Jessica's immediate eagerness to help with my finances, her suggestion of investment management services, her willingness to come over and review my paperwork. She'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and I'd just provided it. But I'd also gained something valuable. Now I would be able to observe their strategy firsthand, to see how they plan to transition from helpful family members to financial guardians. Friday afternoon brought Margaret Chen's report, a thick document that laid out my investment performance in impressive detail. Over the past 3 years, I'd achieved an average annual return of 18%, significantly outperforming the S&P 500 and most professional fund managers. My Sony position alone had generated returns that exceeded 40% since my initial purchase. The report included detailed analysis of my decision-making process, documenting how I researched companies, analyzed market trends, and made strategic adjustments to my portfolio based on changing conditions. Margaret had included her professional assessment that my investment choices demonstrated sophisticated understanding of market dynamics and exceptional analytical judgment. This document would serve as powerful evidence of my mental competency if anyone tried to argue that I was too confused or impaired to manage my own finances. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather that made my garden glow like a painting. I was deadheading roses when Jessica and Marcus arrived, both carrying laptops and looking prepared for serious business. "Hi, Mom, you look better today," Jessica said, kissing my cheek. "How are you feeling?" "A little clearer, thank you. Some days are better than others." Marcus set up his laptop on my dining room table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "We thought we'd help you get organized today, maybe set up some systems to make things easier for you." "That's so thoughtful. I really have been struggling to keep track of everything." For the next hour, I watched them work with practiced coordination. Jessica reviewed my monthly bills, making notes about payment schedules and amounts. Marcus examined my bank statements, asking questions about various transactions and deposits. "Mom, you have quite a bit of money just sitting and checking. That's not earning any interest." "I know, but I like having cash available for emergencies." "How much do you typically keep for emergencies?" Marcus asked, his fingers moving across his laptop keyboard. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe 10 or 20,000. Their exchange of glances was so quick I almost missed it, but I caught the surprise in Marcus's expression. 10 or 20,000 was apparently more than they'd expected me to have readily available. That's actually quite a lot for emergency funds, Jessica said carefully. Most financial advisors recommend 3 to 6 months of expenses. I suppose I'm overly cautious. Marcus leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver helpful advice. You know, Vivian, we've been thinking about your overall financial picture, and there might be some opportunities to optimize things. Optimize? Well, you have this beautiful house, but it's a lot of space for one person, and the maintenance costs must be substantial. If you sold it and moved somewhere smaller, the proceeds could be invested to generate income for years. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. And we found some really lovely senior communities that handle all the maintenance and provide activities and social opportunities. You could have a much simpler lifestyle. But what about my investments? I'd still need to manage those. Actually, Marcus said, that's something we've been researching too. There are professional management services that specialize in handling portfolios for retirees. They take care of all the decisions and paperwork, and you just receive regular income payments. Professional management services that would charge fees for managing a portfolio I'd been successfully growing on my own. Services that would likely move my money into conservative investments that generated steady fees rather than the growth I'd been achieving. How much would something like that cost? Usually around 1 to 2% annually, Jessica replied. But think about the peace of mind. No more worrying about market fluctuations or making investment decisions. 1 to 2% of my $4 million portfolio would mean $40,000 to $80,000 in annual fees. Money that would come directly out of my returns and go into the pockets of fund managers who might not perform as well as I'd been doing on my own. That does sound simpler, I agreed. But don't I need to keep control of my own money? Marcus and Jessica exchanged another look, this one longer and more significant. Well, Marcus said carefully, that depends on your comfort level with making complex financial decisions. If you're feeling confused or overwhelmed, it might actually be safer to have professional oversight. We could help you set up power of attorney arrangements, Jessica suggested. That way, if you ever felt too overwhelmed to handle things, we could step in and make sure everything was taken care of properly. Power of attorney. The legal mechanism that would give them complete control over my financial decisions. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice steady. How would that work? It's simple, Marcus explained.
You'd sign some documents that would allow us to act on your behalf if needed. We wouldn't interfere with your normal decisions, but if you ever became unable to manage things, we'd be legally authorized to take care of everything. What if I disagreed with your decisions? Jessica's smile was warm and reassuring. Mom, we'd never do anything you didn't want. This is just about making sure you're protected if something happens. But I'd read enough about power of attorney arrangements to know that once they were in place, my preferences could become secondary to what Jessica and Marcus decided was in my best interest. And given their enthusiasm for professional management services and assisted living facilities, I had a clear sense of what they thought would be best. I suppose that makes sense, I said slowly. When would we need to do something like that? Actually, Jessica said, we brought some preliminary paperwork today just in case you were ready to start the process. They'd brought paperwork to my house on a casual Saturday visit to help me get organized? The premeditation was breathtaking. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled out a folder containing what looked like legal documents. These are standard power of attorney forms. We could fill them out today and have them notarized next week. I looked at the papers with the expression of someone trying to process complex information through a fog of confusion. This is all happening so fast. Maybe I should think about it for a while. Of course, Jessica said quickly, we don't want to pressure you. But Mom, the longer you wait, the harder these decisions become. And if something happened to you suddenly, we'd have no way to help with your finances. What kind of something? Well, if you had a medical emergency, or if your memory problems got worse, or if you just reached a point where managing everything became too stressful. My memory problems. As if the occasional difficulty remembering grocery lists was evidence of cognitive decline rather than normal aging.
as if forgetting to pay a bill once was a sign of incompetence rather than simple oversight. "I understand your concerns," I said, "but I think I'd like to talk to my attorney before signing anything important." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus closed the laptop with perhaps more force than necessary. "Your attorney?" Jessica's voice carried a note of surprise. "Mom, this is just family planning. We're not talking about anything complicated. David Richardson has handled my legal matters for 20 years. I think he should review anything I sign." "Of course," Marcus said, though his smile looked strained. "It's always smart to get legal advice." But I could see the frustration in both their faces. They'd expected to walk out of my house today with signed documents that would give them control over my finances. Instead, they were facing the prospect of legal scrutiny of their plans. After they left, I called David Richardson. "David, I need to see you Monday morning. Jessica and Marcus just tried to get me to sign power of attorney documents." "Did you sign anything?" "No, I told them I wanted you to review everything first." "Good. Bring the documents they left with you, and we'll go over them together." "David, if someone had power of attorney over my finances, could they force me to sell my house?" "Depending on how the documents are written, yes. They could make any financial decision they believed was in your best interest, including selling property and restructuring investments. Even if I objected, once power of attorney is established, especially if there are questions about mental capacity, the attorney in fact has broad authority to act." That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind my neighbor's oak tree, thinking about the elaborate trap that Jessica and Marcus had been constructing. They'd been conditioning me to see myself as confused and overwhelmed, gathering intelligence about my finances, researching legal mechanisms to take control of my money, and presenting everything as caring family assistants. The irony was that while they were planning to seize control of my investments to protect me from my own poor judgment, I was achieving returns that most professionals could only dream about. My Sony shares had gained another 3% just this week, and my overall portfolio was approaching levels that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life, while still leaving substantial wealth to Oliver's generation. But if Jessica and Marcus succeeded in their plans, that wealth would be managed by financial professionals who would charge substantial fees while likely achieving lower returns than I was generating independently. The money would still exist, but it would be filtered through layers of management and oversight that would benefit everyone except me and Oliver. Monday morning brought rain that drummed against my office windows as I spread the power of attorney documents across David Richardson's conference table. He read them with the careful attention of someone who understood the implications of every clause and provision. "These are comprehensive," he said finally. "If you signed these, Jessica and Marcus would have complete authority over your financial decisions, medical care, and living arrangements." "What does that mean in practical terms?" "They could sell your house, liquidate your investments, choose where you live, decide what medical treatments you receive, and control every aspect of your financial life." "Could they put me in an assisted living facility against my will?" "If they determined it was in your best interest, yes." I studied the documents, noting the careful legal language that would strip away my autonomy while appearing to protect my welfare. "Are these documents unusual in any way?" David's expression was grim. "They're unusually broad in scope. Most power of attorney arrangements include specific limitations or require consultation with the principal before major decisions. These give your daughter and son-in-law essentially unlimited authority. What would I need to do to revoke them if I signed them?" "That's where it gets complicated. If there were any questions about your mental capacity, revoking power of attorney would require court proceedings. You'd need to prove that you were competent to make that decision. And if they argued that I was confused or incompetent, then you'd be in the position of fighting a legal battle while they controlled your finances and could afford better legal representation than you could." The elegance of their trap was becoming clear. Once I signed these documents, any attempt to reclaim my independence could be characterized as evidence of the confusion and poor judgment that had necessitated their intervention in the first place. "David, I want you to prepare alternative power of attorney documents, ones that include specific limitations and safeguards." "What kind of limitations?" "They can only act on my behalf if I'm medically incapacitated as determined by 2 independent physicians.
They cannot sell my house without my written consent. They cannot change my investment strategy without consulting with me. And I retain the right to revoke their authority at any time without requiring court proceedings. David nodded approvingly. Those are reasonable safeguards. But Vivian, if you're concerned about your family's motivations, you might want to consider appointing someone else as your attorney, in fact. The suggestion surprised me. Someone other than Jessica, a trusted friend, a professional fiduciary, or another family member who doesn't have a direct financial interest in your decisions.
I thought about Margaret Chen, who demonstrated both professional competence and personal integrity in managing my investments, or Dr. Morrison, who'd known me for years and could assess my mental capacity objectively. Either would be a better choice than Jessica and Marcus, whose motivations were becoming increasingly questionable. "Let me think about that," I said. "In the meantime, I want you to prepare a comprehensive estate plan that protects Oliver's inheritance regardless of what happens with my immediate care." "What kind of protection are you thinking about?" "I want to establish a trust for Oliver that Jessica and Marcus cannot access or control, something that will provide for his education and future opportunities without giving his parents any authority over the funds." David made notes as we discussed the structure of such a trust. By the time our meeting ended, I had a clear plan for protecting both my current autonomy and Oliver's future security. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Morrison's office confirming my appointment for cognitive testing. The comprehensive evaluation would include memory assessments, problem-solving tests, and neurological screening that would provide objective documentation of my mental capacity. I also scheduled an appointment with Margaret Chen to discuss my investment strategy and document my decision-making process. If anyone questioned my ability to manage my finances, I wanted clear evidence of both my competence and my success. But most importantly, I began planning how to turn the tables on Jessica and Marcus. They'd been building a case against my competency based on assumptions and manipulation. I was going to build a case for my competence based on facts and documentation. And when the time came for confrontation, they were going to discover that their supposedly confused and vulnerable target was actually a sharp-minded strategist who'd been several steps ahead of them from the beginning. The key was patience. I needed to let them reveal the full scope of their plans before I countered them. And I had a feeling that Oliver, in his innocent honesty, was going to help me gather the final pieces of evidence I needed to protect both of us from his parents' greed. Tuesday evening brought an unexpected opportunity when Jessica called to invite me to dinner at their house. "We thought it would be nice to have you over," she said. "Oliver's been asking to see you, and we can continue our conversation about those financial planning ideas." "That sounds lovely. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, Mom. We'll take care of everything." I accepted the invitation with appropriate gratitude while mentally preparing for what would likely be another attempt to pressure me into signing their power of attorney documents. But this time, I'd be listening and observing with the sharp attention of someone gathering intelligence for a counterattack. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Thursday evening arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and I drove to Jessica's house carrying a bottle of wine and a carefully rehearsed performance of Grateful Dependency. The modest two-story colonial sat on a street lined with similar homes, each representing the middle-class aspirations that my own wealth could have easily fulfilled for them if they'd simply asked instead of scheming to take control. Oliver met me at the door with his characteristic enthusiasm, wrapping his arms around my waist with the pure affection that made all of this deception worthwhile. "Grandma Vivian, I missed you so much. Wait until you see what I built with my Legos." "I can't wait, sweetheart. Show me everything." Jessica appeared behind him, her smile bright with anticipation. "Mom, you look wonderful tonight. Come in, dinner's almost ready." Marcus emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that read King of the Grill, though the aroma suggested they'd ordered takeout from the Italian restaurant downtown. The performance of domestic competence was as carefully staged as everything else about this evening. "Vivian, so good to see you. How are you feeling? Any better with those memory issues you mentioned?" "Some days are clearer than others," I replied, "but thank you both for being so patient with me." Oliver tugged at my hand, leading me toward the living room, where an elaborate Lego construction covered most of the coffee table. Look, Grandma, I built the Sony building in Tokyo. Tommy's dad showed us pictures on his computer. The irony hit me like a physical blow. My grandson had constructed a replica of the headquarters of the company whose shares I owned, the company whose stock performance had contributed significantly to my wealth, the company that could have bought him that PlayStation he'd wanted if only his parents knew the truth about their supposedly impoverished mother. It's magnificent, Oliver. You're such a talented builder. Daddy says Sony makes lots of different things, not just PlayStations. They make cameras and music and movies too. Marcus nodded from the kitchen doorway. It's actually a pretty diversified company. Probably a solid investment if someone had the money for that kind of thing. If someone had the money. I owned enough Sony stock to fund Oliver's college education, graduate school, and whatever entrepreneurial dreams he might develop. But his father saw me as someone who couldn't afford a $300 gaming console. Dinner unfolded with the careful choreography I'd come to expect from Jessica and Marcus. Conversation flowed through safe topics while they observed my responses for signs of confusion or difficulty. I played my part perfectly, occasionally pausing as if searching for words, asking them to repeat information, expressing gratitude for their patience with my supposed cognitive struggles. "Mom, you seem a little tired tonight," Jessica observed as we finished the main course. "Are you sleeping well?" "Not really. I worry about so many things now. The finances, the house maintenance, whether I'm making good decisions about everything." Marcus leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "That's exactly what we wanted to talk about tonight. We've been doing more research about ways to help reduce that stress for you." "Oh?" Jessica reached for a folder that had been sitting on the kitchen counter. "We found some really excellent senior communities that specialize in helping people transition to simpler living arrangements." Senior communities, the euphemism for the assisted living facilities they wanted me to consider. I accepted the glossy brochures with appropriately overwhelmed gratitude. "These look very nice, but so expensive." "Actually, Mom, that's the beautiful part. If you sold your house, the proceeds would more than cover years of care in a place like this." I studied the brochures with the expression of someone trying to process complex information through a fog of confusion. The facilities were indeed attractive, with landscaped grounds, activity centers, and medical staff on site. They were also institutional, regardless of how beautifully appointed, places where residents followed schedules determined by others and lived according to rules designed for the lowest common denominator of capability. "But what about all my things? My garden? The memories?" Marcus's voice carried gentle firmness. "Vivian, sometimes we have to let go of things that have become too much to handle. These places would give you community, activities, medical support. You'd make new memories. New memories in a place where I'd be treated as an elderly person whose best years were behind her, rather than the sharp-minded investor I actually was. New memories surrounded by people who, unlike me, might genuinely need institutional care." "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "But it's such a big decision." "Of course it is," Jessica agreed. "That's why we also brought those power of attorney documents we mentioned. If you signed them, you wouldn't have to worry about making these big decisions alone." There it was, the real purpose of this evening. They'd softened me up with concern about my living situation, overwhelmed me with information about senior communities, and now they were presenting their legal authority as the solution to problems they'd helped create in my mind. "I did talk to my attorney about those papers," I said. The temperature in the room shifted noticeably. Marcus set down his wine glass with careful precision. "What did he say?" Jessica's voice remained light, but I caught the underlying tension. "He said they were very comprehensive, that you'd be able to make all kinds of decisions for me if I became unable to handle things myself." "That's exactly right, Mom. It's just protection for your future." "But he also said I should understand everything I'm signing. He wants to review the documents with me and maybe make some small changes." Jessica and Marcus exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd suspected about their timeline and urgency. "What kind of changes?" Marcus asked. "Oh, I don't really understand all the legal language. Something about limitations and safeguards. He said most people include those in documents like this." "Mom," Jessica's voice carried a note of frustration she was trying to conceal. These are standard forms. Adding complications might just make things more difficult if we ever need to help you. David said the same thing, but he insisted on reviewing everything anyway. You know how lawyers are. Oliver had been quietly building with his Legos during this adult conversation, but suddenly he looked up with the directness that only children possess. "Mommy, why does Grandma Vivian need papers to make decisions? She's really smart. She taught me about compound interest last week." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's smile became strained. "Sometimes when people get older, sweetheart, they need help from family to make sure they don't make mistakes. But Grandma doesn't make mistakes. She knows everything about money and investments." Marcus cleared his throat. "Oliver, why don't you take your Legos to your room so the adults can finish talking? Can I stay with Grandma? I want to show her my other buildings." "Not right now, buddy. This is grown-up conversation time." Oliver's expression showed the disappointment of a child being excluded from something interesting, but he gathered his Legos obediently. As he passed my chair, he whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "I still think you're the smartest person I know, Grandma Vivian." After he left the room, Jessica's composure cracked slightly. "Mom, I hope you're not giving Oliver the wrong impression about financial matters. Children his age don't need to worry about adult concerns. I just answered his questions about how money grows over time." "What kind of questions?" I had Jessica's full attention now, and I could see Marcus leaning forward with sharp interest. "He asked why some people have more money than others, so I explained about saving and investing, basic concepts." "You talked to him about investing?" Marcus's voice carried surprise. "Just simple things. How money in the bank earns interest, how companies sell shares to raise money, how the stock market works." Jessica and Marcus looked at each other with expressions I couldn't quite read, confusion mixed with something that looked almost like alarm. "Mom, that's pretty complex material for a 7-year-old. Children are smarter than we give them credit for." Oliver understood everything perfectly. The conversation moved to other topics after that, but I noticed that Jessica and Marcus seemed distracted, as if my mention of discussing investments with Oliver had derailed their evening's agenda. As we prepared to leave, Jessica walked me to my car with unusual solicitousness. "Mom, about those conversations with Oliver, maybe it would be better to keep financial discussions simpler. We don't want to confuse him." "Of course, sweetheart. I'll be more careful." But driving home, I reflected on the evening's revelations. Jessica and Marcus had expected their supposedly confused mother to be overwhelmed by discussions of senior communities and grateful for their offer to handle complex decisions through power of attorney. Instead, they'd encountered someone who spoke knowledgeably about investments and had taught their son about compound interest. The contradiction was becoming harder for them to ignore, and I could see doubt creeping into their assumptions about my mental state. Friday morning brought a call from Dr. Morrison's office with the results of my cognitive evaluation. "Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Morrison would like to discuss your test results. Could you come in this afternoon?" The appointment was brief and decisive. Dr. Morrison reviewed my scores with the satisfaction of a physician whose clinical judgment had been validated. "Vivian, your cognitive function is exceptional for someone of any age, let alone 72. Memory, processing speed, problem-solving ability, all well above average. There's no indication of any cognitive impairment whatsoever. Could you put that assessment in writing?" "Of course. Is this for insurance purposes?" "It's for personal documentation." He handed me a formal letter on his medical letterhead stating unequivocally that I showed no signs of cognitive decline and was fully capable of making complex decisions about my personal and financial affairs. That afternoon, Margaret Chen provided similar validation of my investment competence. "Vivian, I've completed the analysis you requested. Your portfolio performance over the past 3 years has been remarkable. You've consistently outperformed market benchmarks and demonstrated sophisticated sophisticated understanding of sector trends and company fundamentals. Her written report documented every aspect of my investment success, from my prescient purchases of technology stocks to my strategic adjustments during market volatility. The Sony position she highlighted as particularly astute, noting that I'd accumulated shares at optimal entry points and held them through periods when less experienced investors might have sold. If anyone questions your ability to manage your investments, Marcus concluded, this report provides clear evidence that you're one of the most successful individual investors I've worked with. Armed with medical and financial documentation of my competence, I spent Saturday morning with David Richardson reviewing the alternative power of attorney documents he'd prepared.
These include all the safeguards you requested, he explained. Limited scope, medical certification requirements for activation, consultation requirements for major decisions, and unrestricted revocation rights. What if Jessica and Marcus refuse to accept these limitations? David's expression was serious. Then you'll know their true motivations. People who genuinely care about your welfare should welcome safeguards that protect your autonomy. Sunday arrived with unseasonable warmth that made my garden glow like a masterpiece. I was watering my roses when Jessica's car pulled into the driveway, earlier than expected and without advance notice. She approached with the determined stride of someone who'd made an important decision. "Mom, we need to talk. I've been thinking about our conversation Thursday night." "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "This situation with your attorney reviewing the power of attorney documents. I'm concerned that he might be taking advantage of you." The accusation was so unexpected that I almost laughed. David Richardson, who'd been handling my legal affairs for 2 decades with impeccable integrity, was supposedly taking advantage of me by insisting on safeguards that protected my interests. How do you mean? Lawyers make money by complicating simple situations. These power of attorney forms are standard documents that thousands of families use. Adding restrictions and limitations just creates more billable hours for him. I see. Mom, I think we should just go ahead and sign the original documents, today. I brought them with me, and I can notarize them at the bank. The urgency was unmistakable now. Whatever had changed Jessica's timeline, she was determined to secure those signatures immediately. Why the rush, sweetheart? It's not a rush, Mom. It's just that the longer we wait, the more complicated this gets. And honestly, after talking to you Thursday night, I'm more worried about your judgment than ever. My judgment? The things you told Oliver about investments. The way you discussed complex financial concepts with a 7-year-old. It shows a lack of appropriate boundaries and decision-making. I stared at my daughter, processing the breathtaking audacity of her argument. Teaching my grandson about compound interest was evidence of poor judgment that justified stripping away my legal autonomy. I was just answering his questions. Mom, that's exactly what I mean. You don't recognize when your responses are inappropriate for the situation. Marcus appeared from the car, carrying the familiar leather portfolio containing their power of attorney documents. Hi, Vivian. Beautiful day for taking care of important business. They'd planned this ambush carefully. Sunday morning, when most businesses were closed and my attorney wouldn't be available for consultation. Informal setting of my own garden, where I'd feel less guarded. Sudden urgency that didn't allow time for reflection or legal review. I really think I should wait until I can discuss this with David, I said. Jessica's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Mom, this is exactly the kind of indecisiveness that worries us. You can't keep postponing important decisions just because they make you uncomfortable. I'm not postponing anything. I'm being prudent. Prudent or confused? Marcus opened the portfolio and spread documents across my patio table. Vivian, we're trying to help you, but you have to let us. I looked at the papers that would sign away my independence, then at my daughter and son-in-law who were prepared to pressure an elderly woman into surrendering her legal rights on a Sunday morning in her own garden. The time had come to end this charade. You know what, Jessica? You're absolutely right. I have been confused about something. Relief flooded her face. I'm so glad you're ready to move forward with this, Mom. I've been confused about why you think I need help managing money when I'm actually quite successful at it. Marcus looked up from arranging signature pages. Successful at what? Managing my investments, generating returns that most professional fund managers would envy, building wealth that could support multiple generations of our family. Jessica's smile faltered. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I walked to my back door and retrieved the folder I'd prepared for this moment. Medical evaluation, investment performance analysis, legal documentation, all the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. I'm talking about the fact that while you've been planning to have me declared incompetent, I've been generating 18% annual returns on a portfolio worth over $4 million. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Marcus's pen stopped moving across the signature page. $4 million? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Conservative estimate. My Sony holdings alone have appreciated by over 40% since I started buying shares 3 years ago. I spread Margaret Chen's analysis across the patio table, covering their power of attorney documents with evidence of my investment success. Those Sony shares that could have bought Oliver a dozen PlayStations represent less than 8% of my total holdings. Technology stocks, pharmaceutical companies, renewable energy investments. I've built a portfolio that generates more monthly income than Marcus earns annually. Marcus stared at the investment statements with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "But you said you were struggling financially, living on Social Security and Dad's pension." "I never said I was struggling. You assumed I was struggling based on your own preconceptions about elderly people and fixed incomes." Jessica sank into one of my patio chairs, her face pale. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because the first time I mentioned being mindful about expenses, you immediately began suggesting assisted living facilities and expressing concern about my ability to manage my affairs." I opened Dr. Morrison's medical evaluation, placing it next to the investment reports. Cognitive function exceptional for someone of any age, no indication of impairment, fully capable of making complex decisions about personal and financial affairs. Marcus read the medical assessment twice before looking up. "You've been pretending to be confused? I've been observing your behavior when you thought you were dealing with a vulnerable elderly woman."
The results have been quite illuminating. Jessica found her voice, though it came out strained. "We were trying to help you, Mom." "Help me what? Sign over control of $4 million to people who researched guardianship procedures and emergency conservatorship processes?" The mention of their legal research hit like a physical blow. Jessica's face flushed with recognition that I knew far more about their activities than they'd realized. "Help me move into institutional care so you could control assets worth more than most people earn in a lifetime?" Marcus began gathering the power of attorney documents with hands that trembled slightly. "This isn't what it looks like, Vivian. It looks like two people who decided their inheritance was taking too long to materialize, so they developed a plan to accelerate the process." I pulled out the final document in my folder, the estate plan David Richardson had prepared. "Which is why I've established an educational trust for Oliver that neither of you can access or control. $4 million designated specifically for his college education, graduate school, and future opportunities." Jessica stared at the trust documents with growing horror. "You're giving everything to Oliver?" "I'm ensuring that my wealth benefits the person who actually loves me for who I am, rather than for what I can provide." "What about us?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "What about you? You've demonstrated that your primary interest in my welfare is financial, that your concern for my safety and happiness is secondary to your desire to control my assets." Oliver appeared at the back door, drawn by the sound of adult voices raised in serious conversation. "Grandma Vivian, is everything okay?" The sight of my grandson, innocent and trusting, standing in the doorway while his parents processed the collapse of their financial schemes, crystallized everything that mattered about this situation. "Everything's perfect, sweetheart. Come here." He ran to me with his characteristic enthusiasm, and I hugged him while Jessica and Marcus watched with expressions of devastation and disbelief. Oliver, do you remember when I taught you about compound interest? Yes, money grows over time if you're patient and smart about it. That's right. And do you know what the most important thing is about money? He considered the question with 7-year-old seriousness. Using it to take care of people you love? Exactly. Which is why I've made sure you'll have everything you need for college and whatever dreams you develop as you grow up. Jessica stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. Mom, you can't do this to us. We have a mortgage, car payments, Oliver's expenses. The same mortgage payments I've been covering for 3 years while you researched how to steal my independence? Marcus gathered the last of their documents, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. We never intended to steal anything. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From the investment success that's generated more wealth in 3 years than Robert and I accumulated in 35 years of marriage? Protect you from making mistakes, from being taken advantage of, from the stress of managing everything alone. I looked at my daughter and son-in-law, seeing clearly for the first time how their concern had been corrupted by greed, how their love had been poisoned by assumptions and expectations about inheritance. I haven't been alone, Jessica. I've been independent. There's a difference. Oliver tugged at my sleeve. Grandma, are Mommy and Daddy upset about something? They're learning some important lessons about honesty and family relationships. Jessica's voice carried desperation now. Mom, please. We made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can start over. You can start over. By getting jobs that actually support your family instead of depending on money you thought you'd inherit. By demonstrating that Oliver's happiness matters more to you than my bank account. How are we supposed to manage without your help? The question revealed everything about their perspective on family relationships. Not how they could contribute to my well-being, but how they could continue benefiting from my resources. The same way millions of families manage, through honest work and responsible spending. Marcus stood, his dignity somewhat restored by resignation to circumstances he couldn't change. What happens now? Now, Oliver and I continue building our relationship based on love rather than financial expectations. Now you learn whether you can be the parents he deserves without subsidies from his grandmother. Jessica gathered her purse with the mechanical movements of someone processing devastating news. And if we prove ourselves, if we show you we've changed, then maybe we can rebuild trust that's been damaged by your willingness to manipulate and deceive someone you claim to love. After they left, Oliver and I sat in my garden while afternoon shadows lengthened across the lawn. He'd absorbed the adult tension without understanding its specifics, but his resilient nature had already adapted to whatever changes might come. Grandma Vivian, will I still get to come visit you and work in your garden? Every weekend if you want to. And Oliver, remember what I told you about money growing over time? Yes, your education fund is going to grow for the next 11 years before you need it for college. By the time you're ready, you'll be able to study anything that interests you anywhere in the world. Even veterinary school in Australia? Especially veterinary school in Australia. As the sun set behind my neighbor's oak tree, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. Jessica and Marcus had seen an elderly woman whose wealth they could control and whose independence they could eliminate for her own good. Instead, they'd encountered a sharp-minded strategist whose success at building wealth was matched only by her determination to protect it from those who would exploit family relationships for financial gain. The irony wasn't lost on me that while they were researching how to have me declared incompetent, I was achieving investment returns that demonstrated exceptional competence. While they were planning to institutionalize me for my own protection, I was protecting my grandson's future from their short-sighted greed. But the deepest satisfaction came from knowing that Oliver would grow up with opportunities that his parents' financial manipulation could never have provided. College, graduate school, entrepreneurial ventures, whatever dreams he developed, all funded by the investment success his parents had been too blind to recognize. My garden glowed in the last light of day, roses blooming more beautifully than ever in soil enriched by 3 years of careful tending. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight brought the peace that comes from defending what matters most and ensuring that love triumphs over greed in the next generation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.